When Katt Williams speaks, people don't just listen for jokes. They listen for subtext. For years, Katt has positioned himself as someone who believes Hollywood runs on unspoken rules, quiet leverage, and invisible power structures. So when he recently hinted at what he described as an alleged game involving Teyana Taylor and Tyler Perry, the internet didn't treat it like comedy. It treated it like a warning. Katt didn't present documents. He didn't accuse anyone of a specific crime. What he did was far more effective in the digital age. He implied, he suggested, he spoke in that familiar tone that blurs the line between observation and allegation. And in a culture already suspicious of power and control in entertainment, implication alone was enough to light a fuse.
Put too much pressure on Tyler Perry. You know what I mean? He ain't put nobody on. The people that been in his productions, they not famous. All of them can walk through the mall without...
The moment clips began circulating, captions did the rest. Words like exposes, game, and behind the scenes appeared instantly, framing Katt's comments as revelation rather than commentary. Most viewers never saw the full context. They saw the most provocative seconds, paired with thumbnails that promised secrets. And once a story is framed as an expose, the audience stops asking if something is true and starts asking why it's hidden. To understand why this hits so hard, you have to understand the characters involved. Katt Williams has built an image as an outsider who claims he refused to play industry politics. His supporters see him as someone who lost opportunities because he wouldn't conform. His critics see him as bitter, unstable, or chasing relevance. That divide is exactly why his words travel. People either believe him immediately or reject him completely. Neutrality rarely survives. On the other side is Tyler Perry, a symbol of power, independence, and control. Perry represents success built outside traditional Hollywood pipelines, but also centralized authority. His name carries weight. When someone implies hidden games around him, the stakes feel enormous, even without details. Power amplifies implication. The bigger the figure, the bigger the reaction. Then there is Teyana Taylor, whose presence in this conversation is what truly shocked people. Teyana's public image has always been about agency and intentionality. She is known for walking away from spaces that don't serve her, for controlling her narrative, and for choosing silence over spectacle. Seeing her name linked, however vaguely, to alleged industry dynamics disrupted that image and created instant curiosity. What made this moment volatile wasn't what was said, it was what wasn't said. Katt didn't explain the game. He didn't define roles, he didn't outline outcomes. That absence created a vacuum and the internet rushed to fill it. Fans began revisiting past collaborations, interviews, and career decisions, searching for patterns that had never been framed as suspicious before. This is how implication becomes story. A pause becomes a clue. A career move becomes evidence. Silence becomes strategy. Once people believe there is something hidden, everything gets reread through that lens. And because Teyana did not respond and Tyler Perry did not acknowledge the chatter, the narrative gained momentum instead of slowing down. Katt's delivery added fuel. He spoke with confidence, humor, and that familiar edge that makes audiences feel like they're being let in on something forbidden. Comedy gives cover. It allows speakers to float serious ideas without full accountability. If challenged, it can always be reframed as commentary. But the impact remains, especially when the audience takes it seriously. Social media responded predictably. Some praised Katt for telling the truth about an industry they already distrust. Others accused him of dragging successful Black creatives into controversy without evidence. The debate wasn't about proof, it was about belief. Do you trust the comedian who claims to see behind the curtain, or the mogul and artist who say nothing at all? Silence from Teyana became especially charged. Supporters saw it as dignity and boundary setting. Critics framed it as avoidance. Neither interpretation was confirmed, but both spread rapidly. In online culture, silence doesn't pause a narrative, it invites projection. Tyler Perry's silence functioned differently. For some, it reinforced his power. Powerful people, the argument goes, don't respond to rumors. For others, it fed suspicion. When power meets silence, people assume calculation. Again, assumption replaced verification. What's important to understand is that nothing concrete was uncovered. No evidence surfaced. No claims were substantiated. Yet the story exploded because it fit a familiar and emotionally satisfying template. The truth-teller versus the gatekeeper, the controlled artist caught in between, and an industry accused of hiding uncomfortable realities. This template performs because it doesn't require facts. It requires distrust. And distrust is abundant online. Once activated, it carries a story farther than proof ever could. By the end of the first wave, the narrative had already shifted. It was no longer about what Katt Williams said. It was about what people believed he meant. And belief is a powerful thing. It reshapes memory, perception, and reputation without ever needing confirmation. This is where the story truly begins, not with an expose but with implication. Not with evidence but with imagination. Comedy collided with power, silence collided with speculation, and the internet did what it does best. It decided there must be more going on. To understand why this narrative spread so fast, you have to understand the role credibility plays in online belief. Katt Williams occupies a unique position in entertainment culture. He is not viewed as neutral, and that is precisely why people listen. Over the years, Katt has positioned himself as someone who believes he was pushed to the margins for refusing to conform. That self-framing makes his audience feel like they are hearing from an insider who walked away rather than someone still dependent on the system. For his supporters, that outsider status equals honesty. They argue that someone who claims to have lost opportunities has less incentive to lie. When Katt speaks about alleged games, hidden rules, or unspoken power structures, it aligns with what many already suspect about Hollywood. That alignment lowers skepticism. People don't ask for receipts when a story confirms their existing beliefs. They accept it because it feels consistent with what they think they already know. But credibility cuts both ways. Critics argue that Katt's history of controversy weakens his reliability. They point to past moments where his commentary blurred into exaggeration or personal grievance. To them, implication without evidence isn't bravery. It's irresponsibility. This split is why his words never land quietly. They either feel prophetic or problematic depending on the listener's lens. Then there's the gravitational pull of Tyler Perry. Tyler Perry represents concentrated power. He owns studios, controls production pipelines, and employs thousands. For many, that makes him a symbol of independence and success. For others, it makes him a gatekeeper. When someone implies an alleged game around a figure like that, audiences don't treat it lightly. Power magnifies suspicion. The higher the influence, the more people assume there must be unseen dynamics at work. What's important is that no specific allegation was made. Yet power invites projection. People began revisiting Tyler Perry's career, business model, and reputation through a suspicious lens. Neutral facts were reframed as strategic moves. Silence was interpreted as confidence by supporters and calculation by critics. The same behavior supported opposite conclusions because belief came first. Caught between those forces was Teyana Taylor, whose presence in the narrative intensified everything. Teyana's career choices have often been framed as acts of agency. She has publicly stepped away from music, redirected her focus, and spoken about protecting her peace. That history made her an unexpected name in a story about alleged industry games. The contrast alone fueled curiosity. Her silence became a central character in the story. She didn't respond to the implications. She didn't acknowledge Katt's comments. She didn't clarify anything. For some, that silence represented dignity and refusal to participate in mess. For others, it raised questions. Online culture rarely allows silence to remain neutral. It demands interpretation, and interpretation filled the gap immediately. This is where power dynamics become complicated. Katt speaks loudly but lacks institutional power. Tyler Perry holds institutional power but speaks rarely. Teyana holds cultural power but chooses restraint. Each position carries a different kind of credibility. Audiences decide which form they trust more based on their worldview, not on evidence. Media ecosystems amplified this tension. Commentary channels framed the story as a battle between truth-teller and gatekeeper, even though that framing was never confirmed by facts. Titles promised insight into the game, while content delivered speculation. Viewers clicked expecting revelation and stayed for theory. The story fed itself without new information. Another reason the narrative felt believable is because it fit a familiar pattern. The idea that successful industries operate on unspoken rules is deeply ingrained in pop culture. When a comedian suggests those rules exist, people nod along instinctively. The idea doesn't feel new, it feels revealed. That emotional familiarity replaces critical thinking. What's often overlooked is how little room this leaves for reality. Real careers are messy, personal, and influenced by countless factors. but those complexities don't perform well online. A single hidden game is easier to understand than years of nuanced decision-making. Simplification wins, even when it distorts. As the conversation grew, people stopped discussing what Katt actually implied and started debating what it said about the industry as a whole. The story expanded beyond the individuals involved. It became symbolic. Katt represented speaking out, Tyler Perry represented power, Teyana represented silence. Once stories become symbolic, facts struggle to compete with meaning. By the end of this phase, belief had hardened. Not belief in a specific claim, but belief that something must be happening behind the scenes. That belief didn't need confirmation. It fed on distrust and familiarity. And once belief takes hold at scale, correction becomes nearly impossible. This is why the story didn't slow down. It didn't depend on new revelations. It depended on alignment with suspicion. And suspicion is abundant online. The next phase of this story isn't about credibility anymore. It's about distortion. About how implication becomes accusation, how language escalates, and how the internet quietly rewrites what was actually said. By the time this story hit peak traction, very few people were actually reacting to what Katt Williams said. Most were reacting to what they believed he meant. That gap between implication and interpretation is where everything escalated. Because once a statement leaves its original context and enters the algorithm, it stops being a comment and starts becoming a verdict. Katt never laid out a clear accusation. He didn't describe a specific incident, timeline, or agreement. He spoke in broad strokes, referencing what he framed as an alleged game in the industry and suggesting that power often operates quietly. In long-form conversation, that kind of language leaves room for debate. Online, it leaves room for distortion. Ambiguity doesn't survive the clip economy. It gets sharpened. The first transformation happened in editing. Longer clips that showed Katt's pauses, tone shifts, and qualifying language were cut down to seconds. Those seconds were looped, reposted, and paired with captions that removed uncertainty. Alleged quietly disappeared. Implied became exposed. This wasn't accidental. Definitive language performs better than cautious language, and creators know it. Once captions reframed the moment as an expose, audience behavior changed. Viewers stopped listening critically and started hunting for clues. Past interviews involving Teyana Taylor were resurfaced. Career decisions that once looked like personal choices were reinterpreted as strategic moves. Silence was no longer neutrality. It became evidence of what no one could say exactly, but evidence nonetheless. The inclusion of Tyler Perry intensified this shift. Tyler Perry's name carries institutional weight. When power is mentioned alongside implication, skepticism drops. People assume complexity, leverage, and hidden arrangements because that assumption feels consistent with how they imagine powerful systems operate. Plausibility replaced proof. This is where the story crossed a critical line. Commentary channels stopped asking whether Katt's implications were accurate and started asking why such games would be hidden. That pivot matters. Once concealment becomes the premise, every lack of confirmation is reframed as proof of a cover-up. Silence becomes strategy. Distance becomes intent. There is no neutral explanation left. Language continued to escalate because escalation is rewarded. Discussed doesn't trend. Exposed does. Alleged doesn't hook. Behind the scenes does. Each retelling nudged the narrative further from its source. By the time the story reached its widest audience, it barely resembled the original comments. What made this especially dangerous is how responsibility diluted at every step. Katt could say he never made specific claims. Creators could say they were just reacting. Platforms could say they don't editorialize. Viewers could say they were just sharing, yet reputational impact accumulated anyway. No single actor felt accountable, but the combined effect was real. Another subtle shift occurred when possibility quietly became probability. Audiences debated outcomes rather than premises. They discussed what this meant for careers and relationships instead of whether it was true. Feeling replaced verification. When a story aligns with existing distrust of Hollywood, it doesn't need evidence to feel convincing. Confirmation bias did the rest. Silence from Teyana during this phase became the most overinterpreted element of all. Supporters saw discipline and refusal to engage with mess. Critics saw avoidance. Both readings traveled equally far, and neither required confirmation. In a culture addicted to reaction, silence doesn't pause a narrative, it invites projection. Meanwhile, Tyler Perry's lack of response was read through two opposing lenses. For supporters, it signaled confidence and irrelevance of rumor. For skeptics, it signaled power and calculation. Again, the same behavior supported opposite conclusions because belief came first. As reactions multiplied, people began reacting to reactions. Many viewers never saw Katt's original comments at all. They consumed summaries of summaries, each one more certain than the last. This echo chamber effect magnifies distortion. Each layer adds confidence while stripping context. Corrections struggled to survive. Any attempt to reintroduce nuance was dismissed as damage control or industry protection. Once people emotionally invest in a dramatic interpretation, letting it go feels like losing understanding. So the interpretation stays, even if it was built on inference. By the end of this phase, the story had stopped evolving. It had settled, not because anything was confirmed, but because belief had hardened. The internet had moved from listening to deciding, and decisions made at scale are incredibly hard to undo. This transformation from implication to accusation is the engine of viral controversy. It doesn't require lies stated outright. It requires repetition, confident framing, and an audience eager to connect dots. Once those elements align, a story can outrun reality with ease. The next phase isn't about implication anymore. It's about consequences, about backlash, fan wars, credibility battles, and the moment when the internet stops observing and starts judging. That's where the damage becomes hardest to reverse. Once the narrative locked into place, the internet shifted gears. This was no longer a discussion about what Katt Williams implied. It became a referendum on who people trusted, who they distrusted, and what they believed about power in entertainment. At that point, evidence stopped mattering. Alignment did. The backlash didn't erupt because new information surfaced. It erupted because belief had chosen sides. Supporters of Katt framed the reaction as proof he was over the target. In their view, the intensity of pushback confirmed that uncomfortable truths were being protected. Criticism wasn't a call for responsibility, it was evidence of fear. Every skeptical response was reframed as industry loyalty. That logic insulated the implication from scrutiny and turned doubt into confirmation. On the opposite side, defenders of Teyana Taylor saw something else entirely. They argued that vague suggestion tied to a real person's name is not truth-telling, it's harm. They pushed back against the idea that implication should be treated as revelation, especially when it drags someone who has not spoken into a storm they did not create. For them, the backlash was overdue accountability, not suppression. What made the divide explode was moral framing. This stopped being about content and became about values. One camp accused the other of protecting power, the other accused their critics of enabling recklessness. Once morality enters the debate, compromise disappears. People stop defending ideas and start defending identities. At that stage, listening feels like losing. As the fight intensified, history was weaponized. Old clips of Katt resurfaced to argue he was either consistently honest or chronically irresponsible. Past interviews and career moments involving Teyana were dissected for signs that had never been framed as suspicious before. Neutral moments were reread through hindsight. The past was edited to fit the conclusion people had already reached. The presence of Tyler Perry continued to amplify everything without adding anything new. His name alone raised stakes. Power lowers skepticism online. People assume complexity where influence exists. Silence from someone powerful gets interpreted as confidence by supporters and calculation by critics. The same behavior fueled opposite narratives because belief came first. Reaction channels capitalized on the conflict. Each new video escalated language and certainty. Thumbnails darkened, titles sharpened. Alleged quietly disappeared. The story became a content engine and outrage became the fuel. Viewers were encouraged to pick a side and stay there. Escalation outperformed caution every time. This is the moment the internet became judge and jury. Comment sections read like verdicts. People spoke with absolute certainty about events they could not verify. Careers and character were debated as if they were fictional plotlines rather than real lives. The line between analysis and harm blurred beyond recognition. Silence from Teyana became the most overinterpreted element of all. Supporters called it dignity and boundary setting. Critics called it avoidance. Both readings traveled equally far and neither required confirmation. In outrage culture, silence doesn't pause a narrative, it becomes a canvas for projection. Meanwhile, Katt's posture reinforced the divide. Every refusal to clarify was read as fearlessness by supporters and irresponsibility by critics. There was no neutral interpretation left. Once a story reaches this phase, behavior stops being evaluated on its own terms and starts being judged by allegiance. What's most unsettling is how accountability evaporated. The speaker could say he was misinterpreted. Creators could say they were just reacting. Platforms could say they don't editorialize. Audiences could say they were just sharing. Responsibility dissolved across the system, but consequences remained concentrated on the names involved. Speed played a decisive role. There was no pause for verification because verification doesn't trend. Attempts to slow the story were dismissed as damage control. Once a narrative reaches this velocity, correction feels like censorship to those already invested. By now, the original implication barely mattered. The story had evolved into a battle over credibility, power, and who deserves belief. Facts were secondary, feelings were primary. And feelings don't require evidence to feel justified. This is the point of no return for most viral controversies. The narrative is no longer shaped by new information. It's sustained by repetition and identity. People revisit it not to learn but to reinforce what they already think. The final phase isn't louder, it's quieter and more permanent. It's about aftermath, about what remains once the noise fades and the reputational residue lingers. Because the internet moves on quickly, but consequences don't disappear at the same speed. When the clips stopped circulating and the algorithm moved on, nothing actually felt resolved. There were no clarifications, no confirmations, no retractions that traveled as far as the original speculation. That's how these stories end now, not with answers but with impressions. And impressions are powerful because they linger quietly, long after the outrage burns out. For Katt Williams, the aftermath looked like relevance. His comments kept resurfacing in compilations, reaction videos, and debates about Hollywood power. Supporters doubled down, arguing that the backlash itself proved he was touching a nerve. Critics continued to question his responsibility. But in the economy of attention, both sides fed the same outcome: visibility. Controversy rewarded the speaker, even as clarity never arrived. What didn't arrive was accountability. Implication has an escape hatch. When challenged, it can retreat into ambiguity. "I never said that, you took it the wrong way," and technically that defense works. The damage, however, doesn't disappear just because intent can be debated. Impact lives on independently of explanation. For Teyana, the cost was quieter and more permanent. She never entered the conversation, yet her name became attached to it. That's the hidden tax of modern fame. You don't have to respond to be implicated. Silence doesn't shield you from narrative once your name becomes content. It simply removes your voice while others speak for you. Her restraint was interpreted every possible way except the simplest one: privacy. Some read strength. Others read avoidance. Neither interpretation was confirmed, but repetition made them feel established. That's how reputational residue forms, not through proof but through echo. Once an association exists, it shows up everywhere people search, comment, and remember. The presence of Tyler Perry continued to shape perception without participation. His silence was read as confidence by supporters and calculation by skeptics. Power bends interpretation. The more influence someone holds, the more people assume there must be hidden mechanics at work. That assumption doesn't require evidence, it feeds on distrust. What this entire arc really exposes isn't hidden drama between celebrities, it exposes how narratives are built online. Suggestion becomes story. Story becomes belief, belief becomes memory, and memory rarely checks sources. Once a moment is framed as behind the scenes, every lack of clarity feels suspicious. Silence becomes strategy. Distance becomes intent. There is no neutral ground left. The most uncomfortable truth is how easily audiences justify participation. People said they were just reacting, just sharing, just asking questions. But collective behavior creates collective harm. When thousands repeat an implication, it functions like a verdict, even if no one intended it to be one. This is the incentive problem at the heart of viral culture. Outrage is rewarded. Certainty spreads faster than caution. And those who speak loudest are rarely held to the same standard as those being spoken about. The system encourages escalation without consequence, then moves on before responsibility can catch up. It also forces a hard question about what we actually want. Do we want truth, or do we want stories that feel true? Because those are not the same. Truth requires patience, verification, and discomfort with not knowing. Viral stories require confidence, speed, and emotional payoff. Most of the time, the internet chooses the second. Nothing in this moment was proven, nothing was resolved, yet something permanent was created, perception. And perception shapes how people are discussed long after the trend dies. That's the real power of implication. It doesn't need confirmation to endure. So here's the final question worth sitting with. When does calling something an alleged game become a license to speculate without restraint? When does labeling a moment an excuse the absence of evidence? And how many times will we watch implication outpace responsibility before we admit the system is broken? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this if you believe the internet needs to slow down before turning suggestion into certainty. And remember this the next time a clip goes viral without proof. Not every pause is a clue, not every silence is hiding something, and not every story deserves the ending the internet gives it.